I've always been drawn to the forest. As a child, I spent every free moment wandering through the forest paths, discovering hidden corners and breathing in the fresh air. There was something magnetic about the way the ancient trees would whisper their secrets in the wind, how the shadows would dance between their trunks at sunset. Nature was my escape, a place where I could find peace and shelter from daily problems. Looking back now, I wonder if that childhood fascination was what ultimately led me to my doom. The job offer as a forest ranger came at what I thought was my lowest point. Funny how life proves you wrong about such things, isn't it? I had lost my previous job, and bills were creating a paper mountain on my desk that rivaled the forests I loved so much. Eviction notices started appearing with alarming frequency, each one more threatening than the last. I was drowning in debt and desperation when the phone rang. You know that feeling when you're reading something and suddenly you get this inexplicable sense of dread? Like you want to reach through these words and warn the narrator to stop, to run in the opposite direction? That's what you're feeling right now, isn't it? Well, you should trust that instinct. I wish I had. But I can't stop now. I have to tell this story. Someone needs to know what happened here. My old friend Robert's voice crackled through the phone that day, carrying what seemed like salvation. As the forest supervisor, he had a proposition that felt too good to be true. The previous ranger had resigned abruptly, though now I wonder if resigned was really the right word for what happened to him. Robert needed someone who could quickly take over the duties, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions about the hasty departure of their predecessor. The task seemed straightforward enough: watch over the forest lodge and the surrounding wilderness. Robert explained that my main responsibility would be protecting the forest from poachers, illegal logging, and any other threats. His voice took on an odd tone when he mentioned other threats, but I was too desperate to notice these subtle warnings. The Forester's Lodge, he assured me, was unoccupied for most of the year. I could count on peace and solitude, perfect conditions for someone wanting to escape the urban clamor. In retrospect, perhaps too perfect. I didn't think twice before accepting. Desperation has a way of clouding judgment, of making us ignore the warning signs that would normally set off alarm bells. The keys arrived by courier the next day, along with a thick envelope containing detailed instructions. Some of these instructions seemed bizarre. Never answer knocking after sunset, even if you recognize the voice. Keep all mirrors covered during the new moon. If you hear singing from the North Trail, walk south immediately. But it was Robert's final words during our call that should have given me pause. His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, as if he was afraid of being overheard, even over the phone. Just remember, Ben, the Forester's Lodge has a history. He hesitated then, and I could hear him swallow hard before adding, and history has a way of repeating itself. I arrived at the lodge late in the afternoon. The sun was lazily setting, casting long shadows between the trees. The cabin I was to watch over was old, wooden, surrounded by a ring of tall pines. It seemed to be in good condition at first glance. The roof was intact, and the windows were secured. The place had its unique charm, the silence, broken only by the songs of birds, and the scent of the trees were soothing. Everything seemed perfect. When I walked inside, I was hit with a mix of the scent of wood and old paint. The interior was simple but functional. The stove in the corner was to be my main source of heat, and the only furniture was a table, a chair, and a bed with a thin mattress. It seemed like the place had been unoccupied for a long time, but that didn't bother me. I was ready for a new challenge. On the table lay an envelope with my name, Ben, carefully written on the front. I opened it, expecting to find some ordinary welcome instructions. Instead, I found something that sent shivers down my spine. Rules for staying in the Forester's Lodge. Rule 1. The front door must always be locked no matter what. Rule 2. Do not open the windows after dark. They are just waiting for that. Rule 3. At midnight, you will hear a bell ringing. Never look out the window. Rule 4. Each night there is a chance you will hear wailing in the building. If that happens, hide as quickly as possible. It may not be too late. Rule 5. Every night at 2:13, light a candle and place it on the table. Let it burn for 10 minutes, then extinguish it with a single breath. If you break this rule, they will come. Rule 6. If you wake up in the middle of the night and hear rustling at the door, do not move and pretend to be asleep. I read the rules several times, trying to make sense of them. The first thought that came to mind was that someone was playing a prank on me. Maybe it was some old ritual that all the Rangers had, a kind of initiation to scare the new recruit a bit. But the more I read these rules, the more unsettling they became. They were detailed, written in a serious manner, as if someone truly believed that following them was a matter of life and death. I decided to ignore the feeling. I wasn't going to let what was probably just a prank affect my work. I unpacked my things, made the bed, and lit a fire in the stove. The evening seemed calm, and I was tired from the journey, so after a quick dinner, I decided to go to bed early. I fell asleep almost instantly, lulled by the rustling of the trees and the distant sounds of nocturnal creatures. I suddenly woke up, feeling that something was wrong. The room was bathed in darkness, and the only sound I could hear was the soft crackle of the wood in the stove. I looked at my watch. It was exactly midnight. Suddenly, in the silence, I heard a faint ringing, as if someone was gently tapping a metal bell. My heart began to race. I remembered the third rule. At midnight, you will hear a bell ringing. Never look out the window. I sat still, trying to ignore the sound, but with each passing second, my curiosity grew stronger. What could happen if I looked? Surely it was just a joke, right? The ringing grew louder, as if someone was deliberately trying to draw my attention. I couldn't resist. Slowly, with my heart pounding, I approached the window and gently pulled back the curtain. Outside, the darkness was so thick I could barely make out anything. But then I saw it. Far in the distance, among the trees, there was a shape. It was unnaturally tall, with arms that seemed too long, bent at an odd angle. The figure stood motionless, but I had the eerie feeling that it was staring right at me, though I couldn't make out a face. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, the figure had vanished, and the ringing had stopped. I stepped back from the window, feeling the fear seep into my bones. I realized I had broken the third rule. And then, in the terrifying silence, I heard something else. A faint rustling at the door. The rustling at the door grew louder, as if something or someone was scratching its claws against the wooden surface. My heart was pounding like a drum. I wanted to approach the door to see what was happening. But then I remembered the sixth rule. If you wake up in the middle of the night and hear rustling at the door, do not move and pretend to be asleep. For a moment, I struggled with whether I should ignore it, but fear had paralyzed me. I lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, trying to steady my breathing. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. I had the unsettling feeling that whatever was behind the door was still there, watching and waiting for my reaction. I lay there for what felt like long minutes, maybe even hours, until exhaustion finally overtook my fear, and I fell into an uneasy sleep. I woke up at dawn, with sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, I hoped that everything that had happened during the night was just a bad dream. But when I looked at the door, I saw that something had indeed occurred. The wooden surface was scratched, as if someone had dragged sharp claws across it. I swallowed hard, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. What I saw that night was not a figment of my imagination. Something had truly been there, something that shouldn't exist. I needed to find out what lay behind these strange rules and why they were so crucial. But first, I had to calm down and prepare for another night. I was starting to understand why the previous guard had abruptly resigned from this job. After experiencing such strange and terrifying events on my first night, I seriously considered doing the same. But the situation I found myself in left me with little choice. It all came down to money. My debts were growing day by day, and the bank was calling more frequently. I was trapped in a credit trap that I couldn't escape. The job at the lodge, though seemingly quiet and isolated, had one advantage I couldn't ignore. It offered a very good salary. It was much more than I could earn anywhere else, and at that moment, I needed every penny. For someone else, it might not have been worth the price of fear and uncertainty, but I didn't have the luxury of choice. I had to stay. I gritted my teeth and resolved that, no matter how frightening this job might be, I would stick to the rules and endure until I paid off my debts. I knew I couldn't afford to turn down this offer, so I had to grit my teeth and get through these few months. After all, what could happen if I simply followed the rules? The next night, I felt much more on edge. I was now aware that the rules I had found were not merely warnings, but something that could truly protect me. Nevertheless, the issue of lighting the candle at 2:13 remained. The previous night, I had been too terrified to get out of bed at that hour, even though the rules clearly stated what I was supposed to do. I had hoped that maybe I could ignore it, that nothing would happen if I missed this rule. However, after waking up at dawn and analyzing the events, I realized what a grave mistake I had made. What had happened, the rustling at the door, the tapping on the window, and that terrifying bell sound, might have been the consequences of my disobedience. I had broken the rule, and it could cost me my life. On the other hand, I didn't understand why I had to light the candle at that exact time. What could happen if I didn't do it? Despite these doubts, I could no longer afford to take such risks. I knew that tonight I had to follow every rule, no matter how absurd it seemed. As evening approached, I prepared everything I needed. The candle was set on the table with matches beside it. The clock slowly neared 2:13, and I could feel the tension building inside me. I sat on the bed, staring at the clock, ready for whatever was to come. When the clock struck 2:13, my heart leaped into my throat. With trembling hands, I reached for the matches and lit the candle. The flame was bright, casting a warm light on the lodge's rough interior. I placed it on the table, trying not to think about what might happen if I ignored the rule once more. Time passed slowly, but this time I knew I had to wait exactly 10 minutes. During that time, nothing happened. The silence was dense, almost tangible. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for what I was about to do. When 10 minutes had passed, I blew out the candle in one breath, just as the rule instructed. Extinguishing the candle felt like a relief, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Afterward, silence returned, but this time I heard no sounds. No knocking, scratching, or ringing. I felt that by following the rules, I had avoided something terrible, even though I wasn't entirely sure what it might have been. However, even though everything seemed calm, I knew it wasn't the end. Every night at the lodge was a challenge, and every rule was like a test I had to pass if I wanted to survive until dawn. The job, which was supposed to be an escape from my financial troubles, had become something much more complicated. I had to choose between the fear of the unknown and the fear of losing the only chance I had to pay off my debts. Every night, I promised myself that if I just made it to morning, I would quit and leave. But every day, as the sun rose, I was reminded of the bills I had to pay and the people I owed money to. I stayed. It was my biggest mistake. Every night as darkness fell, my nerves were stretched to their breaking point. I felt like every sound and shadow could be a sign of something terrifying lurking in the dark. Despite all the strange and frightening events, I tried to stick to the rules, knowing they were the only thing that could protect me. But there was one rule that made me particularly uneasy. Rule 4. Each night there was a chance that you would hear wailing in the building. If you did, you were to hide as quickly as possible, because it might not be too late. I felt that this rule could become my doom. On the 4th night, when it seemed I had already survived the worst, I heard it. At first, it was just a faint, barely audible sound, like wind singing through the trees. But the sound became clearer, increasingly resembling wailing, sorrowful and full of pain. When I realized that the sound was coming from inside the building, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I knew what it meant. This was the night. I had only moments to hide. My heart was pounding in my chest as I jumped out of bed, searching for some refuge. At that moment, every part of the lodge seemed like a trap. I remembered the small closet under the stairs I had seen earlier. It was the only place that came to mind. I dashed towards it, quietly turned the handle, and squeezed inside. I closed the door behind me, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. It was dark, cramped, and stuffy, but I knew it was my only chance. The wailing grew closer. I could hear the sound moving through the rooms of the lodge, as if something was traversing the building, searching for me. Every second felt like an eternity, and the fear of what might happen paralyzed my thoughts. In the tight space of the closet, I huddled, holding my breath, listening as the wailing came closer and closer. I heard footsteps, heavy, slow, as if someone or something was moving with purpose, knowing I had nowhere to escape. The closet door was thin, barely separating me from whatever was on the other side. I sat in the darkness, trying to calm my trembling body, praying that whatever it was wouldn't find me. Time passed, but the sounds didn't stop. On the contrary, the wailing grew louder, more penetrating, as if it knew I was near. The air grew heavy, and the darkness around me thickened, swallowing any hope. I sat there, listening as the sounds reached the closet door. The wailing ceased, and I heard something far worse. A soft, gentle breath right outside the closet door. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was wouldn't sense me. But the door began to creak slowly. My heart leaped into my throat, and cold sweat covered my forehead. Suddenly, in the silence broken only by the heavy breathing, I heard something that made my blood run cold. "Ben." The sound of that whisper was barely audible, but penetrated me to my core. In an instant, my whole body turned icy, and the world around me began to spin. The darkness in the closet thickened, and reality started to blur. The last thing I remember was that ominous whisper echoing in my head. Then everything disappeared. I lost consciousness. I woke up the next day on the closet floor in the dim light of morning. For a moment, I couldn't move, not knowing if what had happened was real or just a nightmarish dream. But the pain throughout my body and the cold sweat on my skin reminded me that what had happened was not a dream. The metallic taste in my mouth and the bruises forming on my arms were testament enough to the reality of the night's horrors. Trembling hands, I opened the closet door and stepped out into the hallway. The lodge was eerily silent, and all traces of the presence that had haunted me had vanished. But I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. Not after what I had heard, not after what I had felt. The scratching sounds still echoed in my ears, and the memory of that otherworldly screech made my skin crawl. In my mind, there was only one thought: to get out of here as far as possible. This job, which was supposed to be my salvation, had become my greatest nightmare. Even the best money was not worth what I had endured. I packed my things as quickly as I could, my fingers fumbling with zippers and clasps. The morning light filtering through the windows did nothing to ease my terror. If anything, it made the shadows in the corners seem deeper, more menacing. Fear and terror drove me, as if I had fire behind me. Each creak of the floorboards made my heart race, and every flutter of curtains in the morning breeze sent shivers down my spine. When I closed the lodge door for the last time, I felt something change within me. The sound of the lock clicking into place seemed to echo with a terrible finality. The thought of escaping this cursed place was now the only thing keeping me sane. I got into my car, turned the key in the ignition with trembling hands, and drove away, not wanting to ever look back at that place. The engine's roar was a comfort, a promise of escape, but even its familiar sound seemed somehow wrong in the oppressive silence of the forest. But I couldn't help it. Part of me, full of fear and morbid curiosity, compelled me to take one last look at the Forester's lodge through the side mirror. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. And then, I saw it. It stood there, on the edge of the forest, just beyond the line of trees, staring straight at me. The morning mist swirled around its feet like ghostly tendrils, as if the very air was trying to flee from its presence. I don't know if it saw that I was looking at it, but I felt its gaze pierce through the mirror, through the glass, through my skull. What I saw surpassed my worst nightmares, twisted and corrupted every childhood fear I'd ever had. It was deformed, as if shaped from forms that should not exist in our reality. Its body was unnaturally thin and long, almost like a shadow stretched out in an unnatural way, yet it had something horribly tangible about it. The way it moved defied physics, limbs bending at impossible angles, joints that shifted and relocated with every subtle movement. The skin, if it could be called skin, was gray, dead, like dried parchment, cracked and stretched over bones that shouldn't hold together. In places, it seemed to ripple and shift, as if something underneath was constantly moving, trying to break free. The worst part was its eyes. Two deep black voids, devoid of any life, yet somehow alive with malevolent intelligence. They looked at me as if they were peering straight into my soul, draining all hope from it. In those eye sockets, there was no light, only nothingness, deeper and more terrifying than anything I had ever seen. They seemed to pull at my consciousness, trying to drag me into their infinite darkness. Its mouth was wide, unnaturally stretched, as if its entire face had been torn apart, creating a macabre grin that resembled a smile, but was full of pain and hatred. From between the cracked lips protruded teeth, long, pointed, mismatched with any creature one could imagine. They weren't arranged in any natural order, instead jutting out at random angles, some curved like hooks, others straight like needles. A thick, dark substance dripped from between them, sizzling where it hit the ground. Its whole body twitched, as if it was pulsating with some terrible, otherworldly energy, ready to lunge at me at any moment. Each movement was wrong, like watching a film played backwards and sideways simultaneously. It seemed that it was made of darkness, as if it had emerged from the darkest corners of the night, created by fear and pain that fed on the terror of others. The air around it seemed to distort, reality itself warping in its presence. I felt my heart freeze in my chest, and a shiver went through my body, nearly stopping my breath. The cold that gripped me wasn't natural. It was the cold of ancient graves and forgotten depths. My vision began to blur at the edges, darkness creeping in. But I couldn't look away from those endless empty eyes. I slammed the gas pedal, turning my gaze away from the horrifying sight. The engine roared as I sped down the forest road, unable to rid myself of the image of that monstrosity. The trees whipped past in a green blur, branches reaching like claws across the morning sky. I knew that this vision would haunt me for the rest of my life. The memory was burned into my mind like a brand, each detail perfect and terrible in its clarity. I would never forget what I saw that day. What lurked in the shadows of the lodge would torment me in my dreams, waiting in the darkness behind my eyelids, its twisted smile promising that no distance would ever be far enough, no sanctuary secure enough to truly escape its reach.